What if I told you there's an invisible force shaping your decisions every day, pushing you to buy, to commit, to act fast, often before logic has a chance to speak? It's not impulse. It's not weakness. It's perceived scarcity. When something feels limited, exclusive, or about to disappear, the brain shifts. Time feels compressed. Hesitation feels dangerous. Action feels necessary. This reaction isn't accidental. It's deeply wired, shaped by survival instincts and reinforced by modern environments that constantly frame opportunity as fragile. This audiobook explores how scarcity alters perception, why urgency feels so powerful, and how this mechanism quietly drives behavior in business, productivity, relationships, and personal discipline. Not to manipulate, but to understand, recognize, and use awareness as leverage. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Less. Why we crave what's scarce. Picture a moment you've probably experienced before. A product is available everywhere. No rush, no pressure, and you barely think about it. Then suddenly, a message appears. Limited stock, ending soon, only a few spots left. Your attention sharpens. Your heart rate subtly rises. The decision that once felt optional now feels urgent. What changed wasn't the product. What changed was perception. Scarcity works not because something is rare, but because it feels like an opportunity is slipping away. The human mind is highly sensitive to threatened opportunity. When availability feels uncertain, value increases automatically, often without conscious thought. Scarcity reframes value. Value is not fixed. It's contextual. When something feels abundant, the brain assumes it can be accessed later. Delay feels safe. When something feels scarce, delay feels risky. The mind begins to assign greater importance, even if the objective benefits remain the same. This is why limited editions, wait lists, and deadlines create disproportionate desire. Scarcity reframes the question from, do I want this, to can I afford to lose this? That subtle shift changes everything. The fear beneath the want. At the core of scarcity isn't desire, it's avoidance of regret. The mind is constantly running simulations of future outcomes. Scarcity activates a specific one, the future where you didn't act. That imagined regret feels uncomfortable, and action becomes the fastest way to relieve it. This is why people often decide faster under pressure, even when the decision carries risk. The brain prioritizes removing the discomfort of potential loss over carefully evaluating long-term outcomes. Scarcity doesn't increase clarity. It increases momentum. Why the brain treats perceived loss as real loss. From an evolutionary standpoint, hesitation around limited resources was dangerous. If food, shelter, or safety appeared and you delayed, the cost could be severe. Over time, the brain learned to treat scarcity signals as threats requiring immediate response. Modern scarcity is rarely about survival, but the brain reacts as if it is. A disappearing deal, a closing application window, or exclusive access triggers the same urgency systems as a vanishing resource. Logic may know the stakes are low. Biology does not. This mismatch is why scarcity feels so powerful, even in low-risk situations. Regaining control through awareness. The goal is not to eliminate urgency. Urgency can be useful. It can push action, break procrastination, and force clarity. The goal is to recognize when urgency is externally imposed rather than internally chosen. When you notice pressure to act quickly, pause long enough to ask, what is being framed as scarce? What loss am I being encouraged to fear? Is this urgency serving me or steering me? That brief moment of awareness restores agency. You're no longer reacting to scarcity, you're evaluating it. Scarcity will always influence behavior, but influence does not have to mean control. Understanding this illusion is the first step toward making decisions that are deliberate, disciplined, and aligned with long-term outcomes, not momentary pressure. Chapter 2: The Scarcity Brain, Cognitive Biases in Action. Scarcity doesn't persuade by shouting. It persuades by quietly aligning with how the brain already works. When urgency appears, it doesn't create new instincts, it activates existing ones. Long before conscious reasoning steps in, a set of cognitive shortcuts begins shaping perception, emotion, and choice. These shortcuts evolved to help us decide quickly under uncertainty. In modern environments, they're often triggered intentionally. Understanding these biases is essential, not to eliminate them, but to work with them intelligently. Loss aversion. Why avoiding loss feels urgent. One of the strongest forces behind scarcity is loss aversion. The tendency to experience the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. When an opportunity is framed as scarce, the brain doesn't interpret it as a potential gain. It interprets it as a potential loss. This is why ending soon is more compelling than available now. The first implies something will be taken away. The second implies patience is safe. Loss aversion compresses time. It makes waiting feel dangerous. Even when the rational benefit is unclear, the emotional cost of missing out feels immediate and real. In practical terms, scarcity doesn't make people want more. It makes them fear having less. The endowment effect. Valuing what feels almost ours. Another bias scarcity activates is the endowment effect. The tendency to overvalue things once we feel ownership, even if that ownership is only imagined. Limited access creates a subtle sense of pre-ownership. Your spot is reserved. You're invited. Only a few places left. These phrases don't just inform. They imply possession. The mind begins to treat the opportunity as something already partially owned, which makes losing it feel personal. Once this effect kicks in, the decision shifts again. It's no longer about whether something is worth acquiring. It's about whether you're willing to give it up. Scarcity strengthens this effect by suggesting that if you don't act, someone else will take your place. Social proof amplified by scarcity. Social proof, the tendency to look to others when determining value, becomes significantly stronger under scarcity. When something is scarce and desired by others, the brain treats it as validated. Popularity plus limited availability sends a powerful signal. This must be important. This is why phrases like high demand, selling fast, most people choose this option, dramatically increase urgency when paired with scarcity cues. The logic is simple and automatic. If others want it, and it may not last, delaying feels like falling behind. Scarcity doesn't just say, act now. It says others already are. Decision fatigue and the appeal of fast choices. Scarcity also exploits a less obvious factor, decision fatigue. When people are tired, overloaded, or distracted, they're more likely to accept urgency cues as guidance. A deadline reduces complexity. It narrows options. It provides a clear action path. This is why urgency often feels relieving rather than stressful. It removes ambiguity. It tells the brain what to do next. Under scarcity, fast decisions feel efficient, even when they're not optimal. Using this knowledge without becoming reactive. The purpose of understanding these biases is not to resist every urgent decision. Some deadlines are real. Some opportunities genuinely are limited. The discipline lies in distinguishing internal urgency from externally induced pressure. When you feel compelled to act quickly, slow down just enough to identify which bias is active. Are you reacting to potential loss? Are you protecting something that only feels owned? Are you following others rather than evaluating fit? This awareness doesn't cancel the bias. It contextualizes it. Scarcity becomes far less controlling once it's named. And once named, it can be used deliberately rather than obeyed automatically. The most effective decision makers aren't immune to psychological influence. They're simply aware of when it's happening and choose their response with intention. Chapter 3: Urgency Unleashed: How Scarcity Drives Action. Understanding scarcity at a psychological level is only half the equation. The other half is seeing how it converts attention into action. Scarcity does not merely influence thought, it accelerates behavior. When used skillfully, it collapses hesitation and turns intention into movement. This is why urgency is one of the most powerful forces in business, productivity, and decision-making. But urgency works only when it aligns with how people naturally process time and risk. Why deadlines change behavior instantly. Deadlines create a boundary around time. Without a boundary, decisions float. They remain optional. With a boundary, decisions solidify. The brain shifts from exploration to execution. A clear deadline does three things at once. It limits future availability. It reduces the perceived cost of deciding. It forces prioritization. When time feels open-ended, people optimize for comfort. When time feels constrained, they optimize for completion. This is why work expands to fill the time allowed, and why urgency can cut through procrastination more effectively than motivation alone. Limited time offers and the power of now. Limited time offers work because they convert future consequences into present emotion. Instead of thinking, "I'll decide later," the mind thinks, "Later might be too late." This shifts decision-making from analytical evaluation to emotional resolution. The goal becomes removing the discomfort of uncertainty rather than maximizing long-term value. Used responsibly, this can be beneficial. It helps people act on decisions they've already been avoiding. Used carelessly, it creates regret and distrust. Urgency amplifies action, but it also amplifies responsibility. Only a few left, and the illusion of speed. Inventory-based scarcity, phrases like "only 3 left" or "almost full," creates a sense of competitive pressure. The brain interprets this as a race. If others are acting and supply is shrinking, delay feels like losing ground. What matters most here isn't the number, it's the movement. The idea that availability is actively decreasing creates momentum, even if the actual limitation is modest. The mind reacts not to scarcity alone, but to declining access. Exclusive access and the desire to belong. Exclusivity adds another layer to urgency: identity. When access is restricted, action becomes a way to affirm status, belonging, or competence. People don't just want the opportunity, they want what it represents. Being early, being selected, being inside. This is why early access, invite-only systems, and private opportunities often generate strong commitment. Scarcity tied to identity produces deeper engagement than scarcity tied to price. Applying urgency to personal discipline. Scarcity isn't only external. It can be intentionally applied to your own goals. Self-imposed deadlines, limited windows for action, and non-negotiable commitments create structure where motivation fails. When you decide that an action must occur within a defined frame, resistance loses leverage. The key is clarity. Clear start, clear end, clear consequence for an action. Urgency works best when it removes negotiation with yourself. The difference between pressure and precision. Effective urgency feels precise, not chaotic. It directs focus without overwhelming it. It creates momentum without panic. When urgency becomes stressful, it's usually because the boundaries are unclear or the stakes feel inflated. The most productive urgency is calm, contained, and intentional. Scarcity doesn't need to shout. It only needs to signal that now matters more than later. When used with discipline and awareness, urgency becomes not a force that controls behavior, but a tool that sharpens it. Chapter 4: Beyond the Sale: Scarcity in Everyday Life. Scarcity is often associated with marketing and commerce, but its influence extends far beyond buying decisions. It shapes how people commit, how they relate to one another, and how they manage time, energy, and attention. Once you recognize scarcity as a psychological lever rather than a sales tactic, you begin to see it operating quietly in daily life, often in ways that feel natural, even reasonable. Scarcity as a driver of commitment. Commitment is strongest when opportunity feels limited. When participation is open-ended, people delay. When access is restricted by time, capacity, or rules, commitment solidifies. This is why limited spots works not just for events, but for personal follow-through. A defined constraint creates seriousness. It turns intention into obligation. This applies equally to self-improvement. A fixed deadline encourages completion. A capped commitment increases effort. A narrow window removes negotiation. Scarcity gives structure to ambition. Without structure, motivation drifts. Using scarcity to support personal discipline. One of the most effective ways to apply scarcity internally is by limiting choice. When you reduce options, when you decide this is the only time, this is the only approach, this is the only acceptable outcome, you eliminate mental escape routes. This doesn't require intensity. It requires clarity. For example, setting a single daily window for a habit creates urgency without stress. Miss the window, and the opportunity is gone. The mind adapts quickly, prioritizing what feels non-repeatable. Scarcity works here because it reframes action as now or not at all, rather than someday. Scarcity and attention in a distracted world. Attention is one of the scarcest resources today. When information feels abundant, engagement drops. When access is limited, attention increases. This is why people value private conversations, focused time, and uninterrupted environments. Scarcity applied to attention is not about restriction, it's about intention. By limiting distractions, you increase the perceived value of focus. By creating boundaries around time, you elevate the importance of what happens within them. What you protect becomes what you respect. Scarcity in relationships and social dynamics. Scarcity subtly influences relationships, often without being named. Perceived availability affects attraction, respect, and commitment. This isn't about manipulation, it's about boundaries. When time and energy are clearly valued and not endlessly available, interactions become more intentional. Scarcity in this context communicates self-respect and direction. The key distinction is authenticity. Genuine boundaries build trust. Artificial scarcity damages it. Healthy scarcity invites appreciation, not anxiety. Information scarcity and the value of knowledge. People value information more when it feels rare, specialized, or difficult to obtain. Exclusive insights, hard-earned experience, and distilled knowledge carry weight because they represent time and effort compressed into clarity. When everything is freely available, depth becomes the differentiator. This is why well-curated knowledge outperforms endless information. Scarcity of meaning matters more than scarcity of data. Choosing what to consume and what to ignore is an act of discipline rooted in scarcity awareness. Designing a life around what matters most. At its best, scarcity is not a pressure tactic, it's a design principle. By consciously limiting what you pursue, where you invest energy, and how you allocate time, you create a life shaped by intention rather than reaction. Scarcity clarifies priorities. It forces choice, and choice defines direction. When everything feels available, nothing feels urgent. When what matters is protected, it receives your best effort. Scarcity, when understood and applied wisely, doesn't reduce freedom. It creates focus, and focus is where meaningful progress begins. Chapter 5: The Ethical Edge. Using scarcity without breaking trust. Scarcity is powerful precisely because it bypasses careful reasoning. That power creates responsibility. When urgency is used without integrity, It produces short-term action and long-term damage. When used ethically, it strengthens clarity, commitment, and trust. The difference lies not in the technique, but in the intention behind it. Understanding this distinction is essential for anyone applying scarcity in business, leadership, or personal influence. Genuine scarcity versus manufactured pressure. Not all scarcity is created equal. Genuine scarcity reflects real limitations. Finite time, limited capacity, fixed resources, human constraints. Manufactured scarcity exaggerates or fabricates limitation to force action. The brain reacts similarly to both in the moment, but the long-term outcome is very different. When people discover that urgency was artificial, trust erodes. Skepticism replaces engagement. Future messages lose impact. Scarcity that reflects reality builds credibility. Scarcity that manipulates perception destroys it. The ethical question is simple. Would this still be true if someone checked later? Short-term wins versus long-term relationships. Urgency can close a decision quickly, but relationships are not built quickly. Trust compounds slowly and collapses fast. A single experience of deceptive urgency can undo years of credibility. This is especially true in environments where reputation spreads rapidly. Ethical scarcity focuses on helping people decide, not trapping them into reacting. When urgency aligns with real value, people don't regret acting. They feel supported. That feeling determines whether they return. Transparency as a force multiplier. Transparency doesn't weaken scarcity, it strengthens it. Clear explanation of why something is limited increases confidence. People accept constraints more readily when they understand them. Stating the reason behind limitation. Capacity, quality control, time investment, fair access, shifts urgency from pressure to logic. Transparency transforms scarcity from a push into a guide, empowering choice instead of forcing action. Ethical use of scarcity respects autonomy. This means allowing space for informed decisions rather than rushing people into irreversible commitments. It means clarity around outcomes, expectations, and consequences. Urgency should focus attention, not override judgment. When people feel respected, they engage more deeply, even under time pressure. Recognizing scarcity used against you. Ethical awareness also applies defensively. Recognizing manipulative scarcity helps prevent reactive decisions. Red flags include constant urgency with no variation, repeated last-chance messaging, vague or shifting deadlines, pressure without explanation. Awareness restores control. It allows you to slow down, reassess, and choose deliberately. Scarcity as a signal, not a weapon. At its best, scarcity signals importance. At its worst, it exploits vulnerability. The ethical edge lies in using scarcity to highlight real constraints, guide attention, and encourage decisive action, without distorting truth or undermining trust. Influence that relies on deception is fragile. Influence built on clarity is durable. Scarcity can move people quickly. Integrity determines whether they stay. Chapter 6. Building scarcity into strategy, not tactics. Most people use scarcity tactically. The most effective use it strategically. Tactics chase immediate action. Strategy shapes long-term behavior. Scarcity becomes far more powerful and far more sustainable when it is embedded into systems, expectations, and design rather than applied as pressure at the last moment. This chapter is about moving from reactive urgency to intentional structure. Why constant urgency loses power. Urgency works because it contrasts with normal conditions. When everything is urgent, nothing is. Repeated exposure dulls sensitivity. The brain adapts, learns to ignore signals, and assumes availability will return. This is why constant discounts, endless deadlines, and repeated last chances stop working over time. They train people to wait, not act. Strategic scarcity is selective. It appears rarely, clearly, and with purpose. Scarcity should feel meaningful, not routine. Designing scarcity into access. One of the most effective strategic uses of scarcity is controlled access. Instead of asking people to decide quickly, you decide who, when, and how access is granted. This shifts power from persuasion to structure. Examples of access-based scarcity include scheduled openings rather than permanent availability, defined intake periods instead of ongoing enrollment, clear qualification or readiness criteria. Access scarcity works because it reframes urgency as alignment rather than pressure. People don't rush because they're afraid. They act because the window fits their timing and intent. Scarcity as a signal of standards. Scarcity communicates standards. When availability is limited, it implies selectivity. When selectivity is clear, perceived value rises naturally. This is not about exclusion, it's about focus. High standards require limits. Limited capacity protects quality. Limited commitments protect energy. Limited scope protects depth. Scarcity here is not about demand. It's about preservation. People respect what is protected. Time scarcity and strategic pacing. Not all scarcity is external. Time scarcity can be designed into workflows, routines, and goals. Short, defined windows for execution increase intensity without burnout. They encourage preparation, focus, and follow through. Strategic pacing alternates between open time for thinking and planning, constrained time for execution. This rhythm prevents urgency from becoming chaos. It turns pressure into precision. Using scarcity to clarify priorities. Scarcity forces choice, and choice reveals priorities. When resources are limited, what you choose to protect defines what matters. This applies to business decisions, creative work, and personal growth. Strategic scarcity asks, what deserves access? What must wait? What no longer fits? By limiting what you pursue, you strengthen what you commit to. Scarcity without stress. Effective scarcity feels calm, not frantic. When limits are clearly defined and consistently applied, people adjust expectations. Stress arises not from scarcity itself, but from unpredictability. Clarity removes anxiety. Structure builds confidence. Scarcity used strategically becomes invisible. It doesn't demand attention. It quietly shapes behavior, turning scarcity into a long-term advantage. When scarcity is built into strategy, it compounds. It protects focus. It reinforces standards. It trains decisive behavior. Instead of forcing action, it attracts readiness. Scarcity stops being something you use and becomes something you design. And when designed with intention, it aligns urgency with purpose, creating momentum that lasts beyond the moment of decision. Chapter 7: Scarcity, Power, and Influence. Scarcity doesn't just move decisions. It shifts power. Who controls access, timing, and availability often controls outcomes, not through force but through perception. Understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone who wants to influence ethically, lead effectively, or avoid being unconsciously directed by external pressure. Scarcity is rarely neutral. It changes who holds leverage in an interaction. How scarcity reassigns leverage. In any exchange, leverage belongs to the side that can afford to wait. Scarcity reverses this balance. When one option feels limited, the person who wants it feels urgency, while the one who controls access gains patience. This is why employers with many applicants move slowly. Sellers with limited supply set the terms. People with full schedules dictate boundaries. Scarcity doesn't create value from nothing. It amplifies existing leverage by making alternatives feel distant or unavailable. The psychology of negotiation under scarcity. Negotiation changes dramatically when scarcity enters the picture. When one side feels time pressure, their focus narrows. They become more willing to concede, simplify, or accept less favorable terms to secure access. This isn't because they're weak. It's because urgency changes the frame from optimization to resolution. Effective negotiators understand this and manage scarcity carefully. They avoid artificial deadlines when clarity is needed and introduce time boundaries when decisions stall. Control over timing often matters more than control over price. Scarcity and authority perception. Scarcity also influences how authority is perceived. People tend to assign higher competence and confidence to individuals or organizations that appear selective. Limited availability suggests discernment. Discernment suggests expertise. This is why overavailability often reduces perceived value, even when quality is high. Authority is not asserted, it's inferred. Scarcity shapes that inference. Influence without manipulation. The ethical use of scarcity and influence is about alignment, not coercion. Influence becomes manipulative when urgency removes choice. It becomes effective when urgency clarifies relevance. Healthy influence respects autonomy, clear boundaries, honest constraints, consistent standards. Scarcity should illuminate decision-making, not hijack it. Recognizing power shifts in real time. Awareness is the strongest defense against unbalanced influence. When you feel rushed, pressured, or unusually compliant, it's worth asking, who benefits from this urgency? What happens if I don't act now? Is this scarcity structural or psychological? These questions restore perspective. They reintroduce agency. Power shifts silently. Awareness brings it back into view. Scarcity in leadership and culture. Leaders shape culture through what they make scarce. Attention, approval, access, resources. When leaders are intentional about where scarcity exists, they guide focus and behavior. When they are careless, they create competition, anxiety, or disengagement. Scarcity in leadership should point toward priorities, not insecurity. Choosing where scarcity belongs. Not everything should be scarce. Making the wrong things scarce, clarity, feedback, trust, creates dysfunction. Making the right things scarce, time, energy, access, creates focus. Influence rooted in scarcity is powerful, but only when applied deliberately. When you understand how scarcity shifts power, you stop reacting to urgency and start deciding where it belongs. And that choice, where scarcity exists and where it doesn't, ultimately determines who leads, who follows, and why. Chapter 8. Mastering Scarcity Without Being Controlled by It. Understanding scarcity is not about resisting it at all costs. It's about mastery. Scarcity will always exist. Time is limited, attention is finite, and opportunities are never truly endless. The difference between being controlled by scarcity and using it wisely lies in how consciously you respond when urgency appears. Mastery begins with internal discipline, separating urgency from importance. One of the most common mistakes is confusing urgency with importance. Urgent things demand attention now. Important things deserve attention over time. Scarcity often makes the urgent feel important, even when it isn't. Training yourself to pause, even briefly, allows you to ask, does this align with my long-term goals? Will this matter after the pressure passes? Am I acting to gain value or avoid discomfort? This pause doesn't eliminate urgency. It places it in context, creating personal rules around scarcity. Rules reduce emotional decision-making. When you predefine how you respond to urgency, you reduce the influence of momentary pressure. For example, a rule to wait a set period before committing. A rule to evaluate scarcity claims against evidence. A rule to prioritize alignment over speed. Rules transform scarcity from a trigger into a signal, using scarcity to strengthen focus. Scarcity can sharpen focus when applied internally. By limiting what you say yes to, you protect depth. By limiting how many goals you pursue, you increase follow-through. By limiting distractions, you elevate attention. This kind of scarcity isn't imposed, it's chosen. Focus improves not because there is more time, but because there is less tolerance for noise. Detaching identity from opportunity. Scarcity often feels personal because identity becomes entangled with access. Missing out can feel like falling behind or being excluded. Mastery requires separating self-worth from opportunity. An opportunity expiring does not define capability. A door closing does not determine direction. Detachment restores clarity. Practicing strategic non-reactivity. Not every urgent signal deserves action. Choosing not to act under pressure is a skill that improves with practice. Each time you pause and decide intentionally, you weaken scarcity's automatic hold. This doesn't mean indecision. It means selective decisiveness. You act when it matters. You wait when it doesn't. Turning awareness into advantage. Once you understand scarcity, you begin to see patterns others miss. You recognize when urgency is real and when it's manufactured. You notice when pressure is used to rush alignment. You become harder to manipulate, not because you resist, but because you understand. Awareness is quiet power. Living with scarcity, not against it. Scarcity is not an enemy. It's a condition of reality. Time, energy, and attention are always limited. Mastery means allocating them deliberately rather than reactively. When you stop fighting scarcity and start working with it, urgency loses its grip. Decisions become cleaner. Commitments become stronger. You're no longer driven by what might disappear. You're guided by what truly matters. Chapter 9. Scarcity as a tool for long-term growth. Scarcity is often used to trigger fast decisions, but its greatest value lies elsewhere. When applied intentionally, scarcity becomes a framework for growth, discipline, and sustained progress. Instead of pushing for immediate action, it shapes how effort is invested over time. Long-term thinkers don't escape scarcity, they design around it. Why abundance can stall progress. Unlimited options feel empowering, but they often dilute focus. When everything is available, commitment weakens. Choice expands, but follow-through shrinks. The mind keeps options open, waiting for something better, easier, or more certain. Scarcity closes loops. It forces commitment. And commitment is what converts potential into progress. Growth requires constraint. Scarcity as a filter, not a limitation. Used well, scarcity filters noise rather than restricting possibility. By limiting what you engage with, you protect depth. By limiting projects, you improve execution. By limiting consumption, you improve comprehension. Scarcity here isn't about doing less. It's about doing what matters better. The filter strengthens signal. Time scarcity and compounding effort. Time is the most non-negotiable form of scarcity. You can't create more of it, but you can decide how it compounds. Small, consistent investments under time constraint outperform sporadic bursts of effort. Defined windows for focused work encourage intensity. Over time, these windows compound into skill, output, and confidence. Scarcity doesn't reduce opportunity, it concentrates it. Scarcity and the discipline of saying no. Long-term growth depends more on what you decline than what you accept. Every yes consumes limited energy. Every no preserves it for something aligned. Scarcity makes this trade-off visible. Saying no isn't about avoidance. It's about direction. Clear boundaries create space for meaningful progress. Building systems that respect limits. Sustainable growth respects human limits. Systems that assume endless energy fail. Systems that account for fatigue, attention, and recovery endure. Scarcity-aware systems. Build rest into cycles. Limit scope intentionally. Prioritize consistency over intensity. Respecting limits is not weakness. it's strategy. Measuring progress without urgency. Not all growth needs pressure. Scarcity applied too aggressively can create burnout. Long-term growth requires rhythm, periods of effort followed by recovery. Measuring progress over time rather than momentary outcomes keeps scarcity from becoming stress. Pressure drives motion. Structure sustains it. Scarcity as a compass for meaningful work. What you choose to make scarce reveals what you value. If you protect time for learning, growth follows. If you protect energy for creation, output improves. If you protect attention for relationships, connection deepens. Scarcity becomes a compass, pointing toward what deserves investment. Long-term growth is not about chasing every opportunity. It's about committing deeply to a few. When scarcity is aligned with purpose, it stops feeling restrictive and starts feeling clarifying, guiding effort toward outcomes that last. Chapter 10. Designing a Scarcity-Aware Life. Scarcity is unavoidable. The question is not whether it exists, but how deliberately you respond to it. A scarcity-aware life is not built on urgency, fear, or constant pressure. It's built on intentional limits that protect what matters and eliminate what doesn't. When scarcity is designed rather than imposed, it stops being a force that drives you and becomes a framework that supports you. Choosing what deserves constraint. Not everything should be limited. When you make everything scarce, time, access, attention, availability, you create friction and stress. When you choose what to limit, scarcity becomes clarifying instead of exhausting. Ask yourself, what deserves my best energy? What outcomes matter beyond the short term? What activities lose value when rushed? Design scarcity around priorities, not around appearances. Replacing reactive urgency with structural clarity. Reactive urgency shows up as constant pressure. Structural clarity shows up as calm decisiveness. When expectations, boundaries, and time frames are clear, urgency becomes unnecessary. People know when to act, what matters, and what can wait. This applies personally as well. Clear routines reduce negotiation. Defined windows reduce procrastination. Scarcity becomes built into the structure rather than triggered emotionally. Structure removes noise. Noise creates urgency. Living without the fear of missing out. Fear of missing out thrives in environments where direction is unclear. When values are defined, missing out loses its emotional charge. An opportunity that doesn't align no longer feels like a loss. It feels irrelevant. Scarcity-aware thinking replaces fear with discernment. You don't need every opportunity. You need the right ones. Making peace with finite resources. Energy fades. Attention drifts. Time passes. Resisting these limits creates frustration. Accepting them creates strategy. When you work within constraints, planning improves. Focus sharpens. Decisions simplify. Scarcity stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like realism. You stop fighting reality and start cooperating with it. Scarcity as a daily practice. This isn't a one-time insight. It's a daily practice. Every day involves decisions about what to give time to, what to delay, what to decline entirely. Scarcity-aware living means making these decisions consciously rather than habitually. Consistency here matters more than intensity. Control without rigidity. Designing scarcity doesn't mean becoming inflexible. It means creating default boundaries that guide behavior while allowing thoughtful exceptions. Flexibility with intention preserves autonomy. Rigid scarcity creates stress. Intentional scarcity creates freedom, where scarcity ultimately leads. When scarcity is aligned with values, urgency fades. What remains is clarity. You act not because time is running out, but because direction is clear. You commit not because something is rare, but because it matters. Scarcity, understood fully, is not about less. It's about choosing well. And that choice, repeated consistently, shapes outcomes more powerfully than urgency ever could.